Hey everyone, it's Dave Etchels from Imaging Resource here again, and today we've got a sneak peek at the new GFX 50R. This is the second camera in Fujifilm's GFX series, medium format. We've got that monstrous looking sensor in there. I guess it's, what is it, a 0.63, 0.67x crop factor compared to 35mm. The huge flange, as you'd expect. So this camera is an update from the original GFX 50S, which I have right here. It's interesting. This camera, we're kind of wondering what to call it. We call it the candy bar camera or the brick camera. It just feels really huge, even though it's actually smaller in a lot of dimensions than the original. It's just this big kind of blocky camera. You can see very similar style. Here's a Fujifilm X Pro 2. It has very similar styling and kind of general control layout. But boy, this thing is really big. I'm not sure if you can, how well you can see that. But there's a significant difference in size. Yet compared to the original, it's interesting that the one thing that's kind of curious to us is just how much thicker the body on the original is. The dimension from front to back is just a lot bigger. Now the original has this very nice dual tilt panel on the back. Is a little latch you press and you can flip it that way. So that's nice if you're going to be shooting, you know, portrait format, holding the camera down or above. The new Fuji 50R, GFX 50R, just tilts in two directions, so we don't get the flip out, and that's kind of maybe an understandable concession to having a little bit more compact arrangement. The other reason that I think we just don't quite understand the arrangement. So one of the reasons that the original is so much bigger and thicker is the battery is like down here across the bottom. It seems like a very odd battery location. On the new 50R, it's in a more traditional position over here, going up the side of the camera. The controls, there's some interesting changes in the controls too. The new 50R, we've actually lost a control from the back. The original 50S has this four-way controller on the back, whereas the new 50R, that goes away. We pick up an extra button over here. So there's the two buttons across the top here. Those correspond to the two on the original 50S. But we pick up an extra button here, but lose that four-way controller. So it seems like we're kind of taking a step back in terms of the available controls and buttons on it. So one obvious difference with the new 50R is that it's got a built-in EVF as opposed to this sort of separate EVF that's on the original 50S. This is removable on the 50S, so you can put an adapter in there to give you a tilting ability. I don't think there's additional types of viewfinders available for it, though. And of course, even you wouldn't need it anyway, but this won't connect. The 50S viewfinder will not attach to the 50R body because it lacks the contacts in there. And as I say, you wouldn't really need it anyway. You've got a built-in EVF, but I don't know, maybe you would have liked to have had a tilting EVF on it as well. Other than that, the specs on the cameras are pretty close to identical. It's the same sensor, as far as we know. It's the same sensor, the same image processor inside, but there are some differences in the interface, and in particular for wireless connectivity. And I'll show you, I'll bring that up. So one area in which the 50R is in advance over the 50S is in the connectivity. Under connection settings, we now have Bluetooth settings. So you can pair it with your smart device. We don't know a lot at this point. This is very early. We're filming this before the official announcement, so we have very limited information on the camera. So I'm not sure what sort of abilities we have. Is it as many other cameras are, where the Bluetooth, it's a low energy Bluetooth, and then it'll start up the Wi-Fi connection once it sees the camera, the smart device there, or is it work differently? But we can take a look at the comparable screen on the 50S. I have to keep thinking twice. It's like we're going back in the alphabet instead of forward. And the settings here they're much simpler. In the wireless settings, it's kind of general settings. It's, you know, what you would need to do for setting up the Wi-Fi connection. It does have make mention of smartphone, but there's that whole, as I pointed out, that whole Bluetooth screen that just doesn't exist on the original 50S. And the other stuff is other things are kind of rearranged in there. You'll see on the 50S we've got geotagging out at the main menu level. On the 50R, I have to find it, but that's somewhere back in here under general settings, we've got a setting for the geotagging. So there's a lot more capability relative to connectivity. We don't know exactly how all that works. As I said, we have no information with the camera at all, really, other than just basic specs, and we don't have any kind of a manual, nor have we had much time with it. But we'll dig into that when we actually get into having a testable unit. This is a very early prototype, so I should say that even some of these screen layouts and things could change on it compared to the production. Another obvious difference too is the 50S has this nice little reflective LCD. It's kind of like almost like an e-ink display on the top. That obviously, to go to a smaller body, we've lost that. So overall, it is a considerably more compact feeling. Well, compact's not really the right word. I have a hard time figuring out what word to use. It doesn't occupy as much volume overall as the 50S did, but it still has a very, very substantial feel. Just to get a size comparison, we can take some compare to some other full frame cameras. Okay, here's a Nikon D5. This is obviously, I gotta get this on screen. This is obviously a lot bigger than the 50R, despite the fact that 50R has a smaller sensor in it. I'm going to turn the power off, save my battery. We could compare it to a smaller full-frame camera like the Canon 5D Mark IV, and you can see how that lines up here. So it's only a little bit larger, really, than the 5D Mark IV. Impressive given the size sensor that it has in it. And then there's been a lot of talk lately about large flange sizes. Now, of course, we're comparing apples to oranges here, but here's the Canon EOS R flange against that of the 50R. And then over here I also have a Nikon Z7. Obviously, these are smaller sensors, but it's interesting that the flanges on these new mirrorless are so large. One interesting addition is that the 50R now adds an AF assist light, which didn't exist on the 50S. It's kind of interesting. The 50S is so much bigger camera, but in that position where the AF assist is on this, they have the PC Connect for the flash. So I guess we've picked up a little bit of height actually in the main body compared to the 50S. And I think that some of that space has allowed them to add that AF assist light there. Another difference between the cameras is in the for the video recording fans is the mic and headphone connections. On the 50R, we've got just one connector. It's a 2.5mm non-standard mic and remote connector, whereas on the original 50S, we've got, oops, wrong flap. We've got standard 3.5mm mic and headphone jacks. And I did just show there's our USB 3 connector, HDMI, and then this is actually a 15-volt external power jack. We've got the same on the 50R. Down on the bottom here, there's the 15-volt power jack, but we now actually have a USB-C connector, which is kind of nice. So presumably higher bandwidth. I don't know what the behavior is relative to powering the camera. I don't know if it does in-camera charging for the battery, but we do have a USB-C now instead of the USB 3.1. And the HDMI, everything's kind of all over the place here. The HDMI connector is now up on the upper edge of the grip there. As before, we have two card slots. They're both SD cards, and you can choose how you want to use those. You can fill them sequentially. In other words, you use card slot 1 until it's full and then switch to card slot 2. You can be in a backup mode where it will record simultaneously to both cards, so if a card dies on you, you don't lose all of your shots. Or you can split the RAW and JPEG between the two cards. That's all fairly standard. One thing we noticed in the spec sheet that we got for the 50R is it mentions simultaneous delete of files. We're not sure what that is. We haven't had a chance to play with it. It sounds like maybe what it means is that if you're recording to both cards, whether it's RAW and JPEG or backed up between the two cards, if you delete the file on one, it'll delete it on the other. Don't know about that, but it was interesting as that showed up on the spec sheet as being a difference from the GFX 50S. And speaking of the viewfinder, that's another difference with the GFX 50R is that they have a little bit less viewfinder magnification, and I think just looking between the two with my eyeglasses on, I have a little bit easier time maybe as a result, seeing all of the viewfinder frame on the 50R. It's a 0.77x magnification relative to a 50mm lens in whatever it is, -1 diopter or something, whereas the original GFX 50S it's a 0.85 magnification. So you have a little bit larger view. The subject's a little bit larger in this discrete viewfinder on the GFX 50S. So again, a very, very similar camera to the GFX 50S, a little bit trimmer front to back. We call it the soap block or the brick. It has a very large brickish feel to it. It's interesting to us that Fujifilm chose to go in this direction. We don't know the price at this point. We're recording this before Photokina. We've just gotten, this is a very early prototype, and so we certainly don't know the price yet. I'm guessing it's going to be aimed at a slightly lower price point than the 50S. And it's interesting to us that Fujifilm is going in that direction as opposed to coming out with the next level of resolution at 100 megapixels. We do know that Fujifilm is headed in that direction eventually, because in an interview either at the last Photokina or possibly at CP+, the optical engineers told me that the GFX series lenses are actually designed to support a resolution of 100 megapixels. But meanwhile, that's what we know now about the Fujifilm GFX 50R. Stay tuned for more.